One of my wife and I's typical things we do before we wind down for the night is we watch a TV show. So if it were up to her, we would watch multiple episodes of said TV show. I'm like a one episode and done kind of guy. I get up early. If we watch too many, I pay for it the rest of the day. One of the shows we watched last fall was a show called Toxic Town. By the title, it sounds pretty intense, but it's a true story. It's based off a true story of these moms in Corby, England. And what had happened is this mom, it follows the main character, Susan McIntyre, whose son was born with a birth defect. And she actually had a lot of guilt, wondering if it was her fault that her child was born with this birth defect. But then she started to notice throughout the community that there were actually a pretty large amount of kids born with birth defects. And they started to put it together and gather and realize that they had over 3 to 10 times more birth defects in this community than anywhere else. So then they started to try to figure out, where did this come from? Like, what could have led to this? And as you follow the TV series, it's only a 4-episode show, you start to see that it points back to this construction site, this factory that had been abandoned over time. And the city had decided to take that factory and build it into apartments or some business complex. But in the process of revitalizing the area, they just took the chemicals and other things that were there and just drove them around. They didn't have any plan for how to dispose of everything. And so all the stuff got in the air, all these different things happened, and by the episode 1 and 2, you are convinced it's the city that's to blame. And as the show goes on, you start to see the process of them kind of building this coalition and ultimately moving on to getting a court case and an eventual settlement. And it's a really amazing story, and I could talk about what actually happens more, but what struck me the most was the time frame of it all. See, I watched it in a 4-episode show on Netflix. It took me about 4 hours of my life. But this whole scenario took over 15 years. They saw the birth defects, they saw what happened, and then there was a whistleblower on the company that was doing the work, saying they're not taking care of these hazardous materials like they should be. That led to a investigation, but they didn't press any charges because they didn't know how they could prove it all. So that's 3 more years. Then there's a newspaper article that was written that gets it a lot of publicity. And they think then, well, this is what's going to move everything forward. And it took 2 more years for them to be able to file a civil lawsuit. And I've shared before, I'm a guy who likes the crime novels or the lawyer novels. They all move really quickly. That's not how it works in real life. It took 8 years from when they filed the civil claim for them to receive their settlement. And these women fought tooth and nail to be able to get to that point. They were harassed. There were things done to their house, like violence. There were all these things that happened. People were losing their jobs for standing up to speaking to it. And they went through this for 15 years. And it made me wonder, would I be willing to persevere like that? Would I be willing to want to see influence in an area, to see something change? Would I be willing to give 15 years? Would I persevere through mocking, through ridicule, financial hardship, not knowing what the end was going to be? Because they did not know they were going to get a settlement. It's one thing if you know you're going to get the settlement in the end. It's like we can mostly all get through a work week when we know the paycheck's coming. But what if you didn't? What if you don't know exactly how it's going to end? And have you been in situations like that in your life where you feel called to influence a situation, to see change brought about, but you experience pushback? And it goes slowly. Maybe it's in a relationship. You see things change and you hope that this one class or this one thing is going to help it get better, but it doesn't change right away. It takes time. Or you're at a job and you want to influence the environment of that workplace, and you go in with these great ambitions and dreams, and 2 years in, it's running the same way that it was before. The question I ask myself in those situations is, do I have what it takes to persevere? To see the influence happen that God might be calling me to have in those situations. And that's what we're going to see in the text this morning. We're going to look at a scene from the book of Acts. We have been in Acts a long time. If you don't remember, we started Acts in September. We will finish Acts next weekend. So that could be a cheer, I don't know. But it has been amazing to watch the progress of the church. And this week, we are in Acts chapter 27. And what we're looking at this week is this scene of Paul getting to Rome. If you remember, last time we talked about Acts, Paul had these multiple experiences where he's kind of brought before people. He gives his defense of why the things said about him aren't true. And then he appeals to Caesar. He wants to go to Rome. And everyone's like, he didn't need to do that. He actually would have been okay. But Paul has kind of resolutely set himself to go to Rome. And Acts 27 is the story of him getting there. So you'll see on a map here where they are is they're in Jerusalem. And they have to get all the way to Rome. They're not doing that by a flight. They're doing that by ship, going through those seas. And as we pick up in Acts 27, we see that it's slow going already. They're trying to go from place to place, and you can just tell from the writing of Luke that this is taking longer than it's supposed to. Each stop is longer, and that's where we get to verse 8, or verse 9. It says, much time had been lost sailing, and sailing had already become dangerous because it was after the Day of Atonement. So we might not know our Jewish calendar and when the Day of Atonement falls, but that's going to be late September, early October. And what they would know is that's not the time of year where you want to be on the sea. There's times when the waters are better and there's times where they're worse. Well, you get into October, November, that's when you don't want to be sailing. It's kind of like here, there's like a point of the year where we don't want to drive north anymore. Like you're like, I'll drive north like up through September, maybe October, but then you're risking snowstorm at any point, probably until April. And this past year, my family got invited to go up to Fort Wilderness in December. And we're like, that sounds great, but we knew we were risking it a little bit because that drive is going to take a little bit of time. And we drive a tiny Honda Fit. We don't have the car made for bad weather. But the drive up was beautiful. Our time at the camp was great. Everyone should go if you can. But our last day there, we get a 12-inch snowstorm. And I'm thinking, we have to drive home. And I don't know much about Rhinelander and the surrounding area, but I don't know how fast the city plows get out. I will tell you, not fast. It took us, and there goes the glasses, it took us an extra 2.5 hours to get home from Rhinelander that last day. But it really made us wonder, what would have happened if we would have had to drive the day before in the snowstorm? How much longer would have that been? So that's what they're going through here. This is the time of the year you don't sail. And so it says, Paul knows what's happening. It says, Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in. The majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. So, Paul sees that this is a bad idea, so Paul tries to influence the decision, and he says, hey, this is a bad idea. This is going to bring about disaster. But do they listen to Paul? No. Said instead of listening to what Paul said, they followed the advice of the captain of the ship and the ship owner. And honestly, they should. Paul's a traveling preacher and a tent maker. And you have a professional sailor and the guy who owns the ship who has the most on the line. We can read this and be like, why didn't you guys listen to Paul? Would have you listened to Paul? It's like if there's a medical emergency at church this morning. We have multiple ER docs somehow in our church. It's pretty great. If one of them said what to do during the medical emergency, and I was like, no, I think this is what you should do with my religious studies degree that I have, you should listen to the ER doc, not me. And it says that the majority decided we should set sail. So what their decision is that they're going to try to get like halfway there in the winter. They're going to try to get to Phoenix, this island, and get there so that they have half the trip done, and in the spring they can make it to Rome easier. So what happens next? Well, it turns out Paul was right. There are great winds on the sea as they travel. This wind they call the nor'easter blows through at that time of year. That's the same wind that happens from another scene in the Bible when the apostles are on the boat and Jesus is sleeping and they think they're going to die because the waves are so bad. That's what hits this ship, that same wind. It gets so bad that they start to jettison cargo off. You do that so your ship sits higher so that the waves don't crash over. So all of a sudden, Paul's right in one thing. He said we're going to lose cargo, and they are because they're throwing it off. But there was one line that really stuck out to me. It said, then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. I had to read that a couple times. They went to the front of the ship. They put a rope on each side, and they pulled it underneath and tied it to hold the boat together. That is a bad sign. You've all seen cars like this in Milwaukee and the surrounding area. You've seen, and you've maybe even done it yourself. We had to do it once. We're on a road trip, and our rear bumper started falling off, so we just found a store and duct taped it on. You do this just to get from point A to point B, though. This is like, I do this because this car's falling apart and I need to get a new one soon. Or I got to get to the body shop, but I need to use the car till I could get in. You don't do this on a road trip across country. The boat they were in that they are trying to get now to this island of Phoenix is wrapped up like that with rope. Which makes sense that they would end this section by saying, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. If you're riding in a storm with a boat wrapped by rope, your hope is probably low. And how would you respond if you're Paul in this situation? What did you try to tell him? This is going to be a disaster. We're going to lose cargo. Check. You're going to lose your ship. Kind of feels like you're pretty much on the way there. And you're going to lose your lives. And they already believe it. So in my not so great moments, I'm going to say, I told you so. Right? You should have listened to me. So what does Paul do? Paul says this, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice, not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves and the damage and loss. So Paul did what I would have done. He's like, I told you so, guys. You should have listened to me. He's honest. He's right. But if you look a little further, there's a but. So Paul's going to say more. And this is where he's probably going to be a little more mature than I would have. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So what does Paul do in this situation? Paul doesn't cast blame. Paul casts vision. Paul casts vision that there is actually a better future for them. He moves from the situation around you is awful, and if you would have taken my advice, we would be sitting back in Crete doing all right, to say, I have faith in God. And think of Paul's story through the book of Acts, how many times he has seen God come through for him. How many times Paul was at the inch of his life because people were threatening him. Paul has faith that God's going to do what he said. But Paul doesn't keep that faith to himself. Paul casts vision to the whole ship. I know you wouldn't listen to me before, but listen to me now. Have courage. Keep up your courage. Do not be afraid. Your lives will be spared. We live in a time where it's easy to blame people for all the problems around us. It's easy to blame us, blame our predecessors for the situation that we're in. I think we see this in the political world all the time. Everybody blames the person before them, but rarely is casting vision for a better future. But I saw this lived out beautifully. A friend of mine named MJ, he took over a church that had been a part of just, the lead pastor had a huge moral failing. MJ came from the outside and was hired on as the pastor, and I remember meeting with him for coffee a couple times. And you know what MJ never did? He never complained about the situation he was in. There was a financial mess. He never blamed his predecessor for the financial mess. A ton of their main leaders had left. He never blamed the predecessor for that. All he did was point that church to a vision of what they could be. And honestly, meeting with him, I'm like, are you guys going to make it? I really hope you do. You're a great guy, but this seems like a tall order. And 10, 12 years later now, that church is thriving. But I think it's because instead of coming in and blaming the person before him, he cast vision for what God could do. That God could rebuild that church and do remarkable things. But Paul is honest here. He does say, you're still going to lose the ship. This is not going to be easy. Paul's vision is not sugarcoating things. You're still going to lose the ship. And then that's what happens. In the next scene of this story, you see them taking soundings, which means they're trying to see how far it is to the bottom. They don't have the fancy sonar that we have now, but they would take these soundings to see how far they are from the bottom, and they start at 120 feet, which seems like a lot, but when you're in a big ship, isn't a ton. And then a little while later, they do it again, and they're already down to 90. That means they're coming in way too fast. There is going to be a problem here. They know it. There's going to be a shipwreck. There's going to be rocks and other things that break this fragile boat apart. Remember, boat being held together by ropes right now. And it says, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboats down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. So this is how bad it got. The sailors know the ship's going down, so they're like, hey, we're going to put some anchors down, everybody. We're going to try to, tough out the storm. And really, they're like, not really. We're going to drop these boats. We're going to go. Good luck. And Paul sees what happens. And it says, then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Paul, who was someone they did not listen to just a little while ago, is now taking leadership of the situation. You see, Paul decided when they wouldn't listen to me, Paul didn't become apathetic. No, instead, Paul became engaged. Paul remained engaged with the situation instead of being apathetic and saying, hey, if you didn't listen to me the first time, you're not going to listen to me again. No, he steps up, and honestly, to great cost to himself. Think about this scene again. Paul says, unless these men stay, we're all going to die. So what do? They cut the ropes to the lifeboats. What do lifeboats do? They save your life. And they cut the ropes to them. They're drifting off to sea. These men have now put their hope in Paul, and what he's saying is right. There's a lot that Paul just took on right here. And I would guess there's going to be some conflict because I doubt the sailors are super happy with him. Because they were about to escape and get to shore. And in their mind, that was the right thing to do because we haven't set up really who's on this boat. It's the sailors, some soldiers and centurions, and a bunch of criminals. And their mindset is, hey, we should get to shore first. Let them see what happens. But Paul steps in. He stays engaged. Because if you stay back and are apathetic, you can't influence the situation. But Paul steps in and leads. And they listen to him. And then he keeps going. He says, just before dawn, so a little time, it says, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense, gone without food, and you haven't eaten anything. Paul understood the situation that they were in. They'd been 14 days at sea, not eating, tense, wondering if they're going to make it. I know how I feel after driving through a storm for like an hour. White knuckles, I'm tired, I just want to get out of the car because I'm so tense. 14 days like that. The emotional, mental toll, and physical toll they have not been eating. All of that for the last 14 days. Paul sees what's going on with them. He says, now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. But not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. So what does Paul do in this situation? In this situation of despair, 14 days, no food, thinking you're going to die. Paul brings hope. Paul provides hope in times of despair for these people. They think they're going to die. They've been on edge for 14 days, and Paul gives them hope. Not one of you is going to be harmed. He keeps bringing it back to God, too. He's giving thanks to God in the midst of this situation. Imagine that in a shipwreck where no one's eating, Paul's here thanking God for the food they have in the situation that they're, maybe not the situation that they're in, but knowing that God's going to bring it. That's the hope that he had. And I think we could be like, well, they're not going to buy that hope, Paul. It's a really bad situation. You just gave them a little bread. Is that going to be enough? But it said they all were encouraged. The hope that Paul gave them encouraged them. Paul was a person of hope. I remember working in my last job. There was a time where the ministry was just a really hard season. A really hard season of ministry, and a new leader took over, a new president, her name was Shannon, took over the campus side of what we were doing. And I remember thinking, this is the worst time to take this job. But over the next year, you saw our organization take huge steps forward because of her leadership. And one of the things she did better than anyone I've ever followed is she kept us having hope. She kept pointing us to the hope that we have in the gospel, that God is a God who renews, who restores, who makes all things new. And within a year or two, it felt like we had turned this beautiful corner. And Paul does that in a short time here. He gives them hope and says they're encouraged for what is going to happen next. They believe Paul when he says, not a hair on your head is going to be harmed. But this ship is still going to wreck. Paul has been clear about that, and that does happen. As you go through the next scene, you see that the ship wrecks. It ends up on rocks, and it can't move forward anymore. And we think after all of this, they're going to listen to Paul, everything's going to be good. But it said the soldiers, in verse 42, the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. So there's still a threat of death. The soldiers want to kill them. They don't want anyone to escape under their leadership. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life. Why did he want to spare Paul's life? I think because he had seen Paul's influence on the ship. Paul had saved their lives. And so he wants to save Paul. But it goes beyond that. It says, and he kept them from carrying out their plans for anyone. Paul doesn't just live. It goes on, everyone does. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and go to land. And the rest were to get there on planks are on pieces of the ship, and in this way, everyone reached land safely. Everybody. Everybody that was with Paul on that ship, on this ship, tied together by rope, on this ship, in the rough seas that they should not have been sailing in, everyone makes it to shore. Paul re-engages. Paul shows perseverance in this. He could have blamed them. He could have remained apathetic. Instead, he enters in and he brings about influence in this situation to the point where everyone reached land safely. But we don't get to know all this story right now, but imagine what they would have been like once they reached land. What do you think their view of Paul's God was like by the time they reached land? I'm guessing these people were much more interested to hear about the God Paul served. The God who brought them out, the God who saved them physically in the storm. Paul's perseverance brings influence in this situation. And as I was reading this, I thought, this one chapter is kind of a microcosm for the book of Acts. It's a microcosm of what happened with the church. The church with this small, ragtag group of people at the start. We might not remember September when we were reading this. There were about 100 of them in a room, afraid, wondering what was going to happen next. And then they get the Spirit and they go and they preach this message, but people think they're drunk and mock them. And all the time as they're preaching, they're experiencing hostility and pushback. But the church is growing. In the midst of all of this tension and conflict, the church grows, and it says at different places that they added 3,000 to their number that day, or 2,000, or daily they're adding people to their number. And in Acts, we see that the church just grows and grows, but they don't just grow in number, they grow in influence. It said they enjoyed favor with all the people because they were a church that cared about everybody. They didn't care who you were or what you had done, they cared about you. They shared possessions. They did all these different things. And ultimately, one of my favorite lines in the whole book of Acts, when talking about the church, it says they turned the world upside down. That is influence. They turned the world upside down. And I don't know how much you know the Meadowbrook mission statement. We say it every once in a while, but we talk about really these 4 words in our mission statement that we want to invite people to discover Jesus. So we want to invite so people discover, so they become his fully devoted followers to influence our community and world. And I'm going to be upfront with you. When I first heard the Meadowbrook mission statement, I was behind every word in there except influence. I didn't like that word. For some reason, I think it made me think of like social media influencing, and that we were like as a church trying to build our brand. Like, here's what we do. We built the brand of Meadowbrook and influence everybody through that. And I knew that that wasn't what it was, but the word was just hard for me to get around. But the more I think about it, the more I think about like what we are trying to do is we're trying to influence, but we're just trying to do it for God's kingdom. We're trying to influence our neighborhood, our community, and the world for God, for his kingdom to go forth. Not for ourselves, but for him. And I think a couple more words on kingdom influence that I think are important for us to think about is first, kingdom influence is always communal, not individual. Kingdom influence is not just about me building up my platform. Look at Paul in this scene. Paul is not about everybody thinking he's this great leader. Paul is about this whole ship being saved. Paul probably had confidence God was going to get him to Rome. God kept doing that for him. But Paul wanted everybody with him to be saved. We see this even more blatantly in some of Paul's language, where in another time he says, I wish all the Jewish people would come to know Jesus as Messiah, even if it meant I was cursed. Paul's influence is well beyond him being looked at as this great leader. He wants a community changed. And that was true of the early church. They weren't trying to build this great big building so everybody thought, look at that great church over there in Jerusalem. Now, they wanted to change the world. And then this last point doesn't make a ton of sense when you say it. It says pillars over platforms. This comes from a book by a guy named Mark Sayers, who's a pastor and theologian. And he said that we live in a unique time where it used to be, to have an influence, you needed to be a pillar in a community or as an institution. You needed to be around for a long time because people got to know your character. They got to trust you. And now it feels like to have an influence, all you need is a platform online. And he's not knocking that. He's not saying that there's not value in that, but biblical change consistently happened through people who were pillars. Even when the people are in exile, God tells them in Jeremiah to plant roots, to live for the flourishing of the city. Because he says this is what's important. We gotta anchor in and become people who are trusted, people who point people back to the God of the Bible. And if you just pop in and pop out, people aren't going to trust you like that. But a pillar in a community is the place where people go when things get hard. I think individuals can be, and so can churches, can be pillars. And so the question becomes, what does it look like for us to do this? What does it look like for us? We're not on a boat falling apart, although sometimes the culture around us might feel like that. But what does it look like for us to be people of kingdom influence? And I want to look at this two ways. I want to look at it individually, and I want to think about it corporately. So what does it look like for you individually to be a person of kingdom influence? Where does God have you? Maybe family, maybe it's your neighborhood, maybe it's your workplace, friends that you have. What does it look like to be someone who casts vision for a better future? Well, people are grumbling and moaning about the world around them. What does it look like to point people to Jesus in the area that you're in? What does it look like to stay engaged? For some of us, we've tried to reach out. We've tried to be a part. People haven't listened, and we're like, I just want to go and kind of go off by myself now. It's easier that way. But what does it look like to persevere and stay engaged in hard situations? And what does it look like to be people of hope? Because I believe people need hope right now. They need the hope that Jesus has to offer. I was at a friend's party a little bit ago, just under a week ago, and it was a retirement party for a friend of mine, and I got to see this lived out in their life. Because I started to talk to different people at the party who I thought were their kids, and they weren't. They were just like friends of their kids, and they kept saying, well, we just kind of hung out here all growing up. We just kept coming over. And they showed love to us, and we just loved them so much. They're like my second parents. This was the refrain at this party. And I thought, that's a people who've been engaged. That's a people who have an influence where not only did you have this impact on them while they were going through high school, but they're coming to your retirement party thinking that you are like their second parents. That's the person I want to be. That's the influence I want to have in places. It's not momentary. It lasts. So think through, what does that look like to be people of influence for God's kingdom in where he has you? But then, what does it look like for us as a church? What does it look like for Meadowbrook Church to be a church of influence in our community? To have an impact on those around us, to cast vision that says, Jesus is better. I know it is hard around us, and there are multiple trials that people are going through. We want to be able to point them to Jesus in the midst of that. We want to be engaged in what's going on. We don't want to be that church that pulls away, that has a holy huddle off in a corner. It's why we chose to remodel this church and not move. Because you'll hear us say often, we are a neighborhood church and we want to be that. So what does it look like for us to engage this neighborhood and the neighborhoods that we live in? That's what we want to be true. And we want to hear from you. What are some of your ideas for how we can do that? And then how do we provide hope? How do we point people to this fact that we have a God who makes all things new? That through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, everything has changed. And it changes how we face the world. He brings hope to us. So how do we corporately, as a church, bring hope? And I want us just to think through that. As the worship team comes up, I want you to think through, what does it look like for me individually to engage in this? How could I be a person of influence for God's kingdom? And how does my community here at church, if you're in men's ministry, women's ministry, neighborhood community, whatever, how do we be a part of having an influence on those around us? Because ultimately, I think that's what God's desire for us is. Let me pray. Jesus, we thank you that you give us hope, that in the midst of everything going on around us, the brokenness, the pain, that we know that you are a God who's in the business of restoration, of redemption. Thank you for what you've done in our own lives, and pray that you would give us a vision for how you would continue to do that in our sphere of influence and in the communities around us. Amen.